An elderly couple disappeared on a road trip, but 5 years later, their grandson spots their RV on Google Maps and discovers something unbelievable. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The cursor blinked steadily on the computer screen, illuminating Dylan Wilson's gaunt face in the otherwise dark apartment. His bloodshot eyes remained fixed on the satellite image displayed before him. The unmistakable brown and white vintage motorhome, partially destroyed, nestled in an unmapped remote area of the Grand Canyon. 5 years of fruitless searching had led to this moment, this pixel-perfect validation that nobody believed possible. Dylan leaned closer, his trembling fingers hovering over the keyboard as if afraid the image might disappear if he touched it. The motorhome's distinctive pattern was visible even from the satellite view, the same pattern he'd grown up seeing parked in his grandparents' driveway, the same one he'd helped Harold polish every summer until its chrome trim gleamed in the Arizona sun. A fleeting memory surfaced. 10-year-old Dylan, standing proudly beside the freshly washed motorhome, Harold's arm around his shoulders, Martha snapping the picture with her trusty Polaroid. "One day we'll take you on the ultimate adventure," Harold had promised, his weathered face crinkling with enthusiasm. That adventure had come, but without Dylan, and had somehow ended in their disappearance. The apartment around him reflected his obsession. Maps covered most of the wall space, red pins marking possible sighting locations, yellow ones indicating searched areas. Newspaper clippings and printouts of search reports were stacked in precarious piles. His once promising photography career, landscapes had been his specialty, was reduced to the occasional commercial gig to pay rent. The camera equipment gathering dust in the corner was worth more than everything else he owned combined. Dylan pushed back from the desk, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He began pacing, running his hands through his unwashed hair. This wasn't like the other leads, the blurry convenience store footage from Nevada, the reported sighting in Utah that turned out to be a different elderly couple. This was concrete, verifiable. The distinctive shape and coloring, the location in the remote area where their last credit card purchase had been traced. It all fit. His phone vibrated aggressively on the desk. The screen displayed, "Mom, 6th call." Dylan ignored it again. Jennifer had given up on the search years ago, had even held a memorial service that Dylan refused to attend. "You need to move on," she'd pleaded countless times. "This obsession is destroying you." She wouldn't understand what this discovery meant. With sudden determination, Dylan yanked open his closet and pulled out a heavy duffel bag. He moved with frantic energy, methodically packing his most expensive camera equipment alongside basic survival gear, water purification tablets, first aid kit, thermal blankets, hiking boots, items he'd kept ready for years just in case. The phone continued its persistent vibration. Dylan glanced at it momentarily before silencing it completely. The voicemail count increased by 1. No doubt another plea from his mother after receiving his frantic message about finding the motorhome. He couldn't deal with her skepticism now. As he dragged the heavy bag down the hallway of his apartment building, Dylan mentally calculated how much money he had available. Not much, but enough for gas and supplies. The photography client meeting scheduled for tomorrow would have to wait. Nothing mattered except reaching those coordinates. The old Jeep Cherokee in the parking lot was another reminder of his grandparents. Harold had helped him buy it when he turned 18. Now at 25, both Dylan and the vehicle showed signs of neglect. The passenger, seat and back, were cluttered with camera equipment, empty coffee cups, and more maps. He tossed his duffel bag into the trunk space and slammed it shut with finality. Before climbing into the driver's seat, Dylan stood for a moment, looking back at the apartment building. The rational part of his mind whispered that he should plan more carefully, inform someone of his destination, perhaps even contact the authorities with his discovery. But the part of him that had spent 5 years searching, the part that couldn't accept that Harold and Martha had simply vanished, pushed those thoughts aside. The Jeep's engine protested before finally turning over. Dylan pulled up the satellite image on his tablet, propped it on the dashboard, and headed west. The morning sun cast long shadows as he left Phoenix behind, the highway stretching toward the vast unknown of the canyon. 3 hours later, the Jeep's gas gauge dipped dangerously low. Dylan pulled into a small roadside gas station, his hands shaking as he tried to operate the pump. The lack of sleep and excess of caffeine had left him jittery and unfocused. He dropped his credit card twice before successfully swiping it. "You look like you've seen a ghost," a voice commented from behind. Dylan turned to find a young woman in the gas station's uniform watching him with curious eyes. Her nameplate read, Maya. She held out a steaming cup of coffee. "You seem like you need this more than I do," she offered, studying his face. "Looking for something or running from something?" The question caught Dylan off guard. Most people averted their eyes from his obvious distress, but Maya's gaze was direct and somehow comforting. "Looking," he admitted, accepting the coffee. "Thanks." "Must be something important," she noted, glancing at his packed Jeep. Dylan hesitated, then pulled out his tablet. "My grandparents disappeared 5 years ago," he said, turning the screen toward her. "This is their motorhome. I found it on satellite images yesterday." Maya examined the image with surprising attentiveness. "That's in the western section of the canyon," she said, zooming in with practiced fingers. "Nasty terrain out there, not on any marked trails." "You know the area?" Dylan asked, hope creeping into his voice. "Grew up around here. My uncle was a ranger," she explained. "But honestly, you shouldn't go there alone. That region's claimed more than its share of hikers who thought they knew what they were doing." The gas pump clicked, indicating the tank was full. Dylan returned the nozzle, his mind racing. "I have to try," he said simply. Maya seemed to make a decision. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the station. She returned 5 minutes later with a piece of paper. "This is the number for Riley Blackwood, ex-ranger who knows those unmapped areas better than anyone. Tell him Maya sent you, and he might actually answer his phone." 2 hours later, Dylan sat across from Riley Blackwood in a dingy roadside diner. The former ranger looked to be in his 50s, with a weathered face crossed by a scar that ran from his right eyebrow to his jawline. His expression remained skeptical as he studied the satellite images on Dylan's tablet. "I'm not interested in your crazy theories, kid," Riley said bluntly, pushing the tablet back across the table. "Just the money. I charge $300 a day, plus expenses. We'll need at least a week's worth of supplies." "I can pay," Dylan assured him, though the amount would deplete nearly all his savings. Riley nodded, then spread out a topographical map on the table. "These satellite coordinates put the vehicle here," he said, marking an X with a red pen. "It's at least a 3-day hike from the nearest accessible road. Rough country, especially this time of year." "When can we leave?" Dylan asked. Riley studied him for a moment. "You really think they're still alive after 5 years?" Dylan flinched. "I don't know, but I need answers." "Fair enough," Riley conceded. "We'll leave at dawn. The Jeep should make it most of the way to this service road. Then we're on foot. Pack light but smart." As they pulled away from the diner, the Jeep following Riley's battered pickup truck, Dylan felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. The roads gradually became narrower and rougher, civilization fading behind them. "Your grandparents," Riley said after an hour of silence. "The police report said they were experienced travelers." "My grandfather was a geologist before he retired," Dylan explained. "They'd been all over the country in that motorhome. They knew what they were doing." Riley grunted non-committally. "Even experienced people make mistakes. Canyon's unforgiving that way." "It wasn't a mistake," Dylan insisted. "The police found no evidence of an accident or foul play. They just..." Vanished. Their credit cards, phone signals, everything just stopped. And you've been looking ever since? It wasn't really a question. Dylan stared at the endless expanse of red rock and scrub brush passing outside the window. Wouldn't you? The remainder of the drive passed in tense silence, the terrain growing increasingly forbidding. By late afternoon, they had left paved roads behind entirely, the Jeep jolting over what was barely more than a game trail. "We'll camp here tonight," Riley announced as the sun began to set, pulling his truck to a stop in a small clearing. "Tomorrow gets rougher." They set up a simple camp, Riley efficiently establishing a small fire, while Dylan arranged their sleeping gear. The night descended quickly, stars emerging with startling clarity in the unpolluted sky. Dylan found himself searching the distant darkness, as if the answers he sought might be written in the constellations. "Your mother knows you're out here?" Riley asked, poking at the fire. "She knows I found something," Dylan admitted. "She doesn't approve." "Most families give up after a year," Riley observed. "Some after a few months. 5 years is a long time to keep searching." Dylan didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch, the only personal item of Harold's that hadn't been in the motorhome when it vanished. He ran his thumb over the engraved initials as he had thousands of times before. "I'll find you," he whispered to himself. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows around their small camp, the vast wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction. Dylan was about to respond to Riley's comment when both men froze at the distinct sound of twigs snapping nearby. Their eyes met in alarm as a human figure moved swiftly through the shadows at the edge of their campsite. In one fluid motion, Dylan leaped to his feet, grabbing his flashlight and swinging the beam toward the moving shadow. Riley was faster, already advancing with the practiced stealth of someone who had spent decades in the wilderness. The figure darted between the trees, a flicker of movement barely visible in the darkness beyond their camp. "I'll circle right," Riley whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Force them back this way." Dylan nodded, heart pounding as he moved left, sweeping his flashlight across the underbrush. The beam caught glimpses of disturbed vegetation where someone had recently passed. He followed the trail, hearing Riley crashing through the brush from the opposite direction. Whoever they were chasing was being herded back toward their camp. The desert night air filled Dylan's lungs as he pushed forward, branches whipping against his face. The moon offered just enough illumination to navigate between the twisted juniper trees, but not enough to spot their elusive visitor. A sudden rustling ahead made Dylan freeze, then lunge forward, catching a glimpse of a dark jacket disappearing behind a boulder. "Stop!" Dylan shouted, surprising himself with the authority in his voice. "We just want to talk." The figure darted to the right, directly into Riley's path. There was a thud and a grunt as the former ranger tackled the intruder to the ground. Dylan caught up seconds later, aiming his flashlight at the struggling pair. "Get off me!" a male voice shouted, fighting against Riley's practiced hold. "I'm not doing anything wrong!" Riley flipped the man onto his back, pinning his shoulders to the ground. "Spying on campers in the middle of nowhere? Seems plenty wrong to me," he growled. Dylan directed his flashlight at the stranger's face, revealing a man in his early 30s with a scraggly beard and wide, frightened eyes. He wore hiking clothes that looked too clean and new to belong to someone truly experienced in the backcountry. "Let's get him back to camp," Riley said, roughly pulling the stranger to his feet. Back at the campfire, the man sat on a log, nervously adjusting his glasses while Riley stood guard, arms crossed. Dylan offered a canteen of water, which the stranger accepted with shaking hands. "Start talking," Riley demanded. "Who are you and why were you lurking around our camp?" The man took a deep breath, composing himself. "My name is Lewis Garrett. I'm a researcher of sorts. I document unexplained disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas." He reached slowly into his jacket, freezing when Riley tensed. "Just getting my ID." He produced a laminated card with Paranormal and Unexplained Phenomena Investigator printed in bold letters, along with his name and a photo. The card looked homemade, bordering on amateurish. "You're a ghost hunter?" Dylan asked incredulously. Lewis winced. "I prefer Investigator of Unexplained Occurrences. I run a website documenting cases like your grandparents." Dylan stiffened. "How do you know about my grandparents?" "When I saw your Jeep at the gas station earlier today, I recognized it from photos in the missing persons report. The distinctive stickers on the bumper." Lewis gestured toward Dylan's vehicle. "I've been researching the Wilson case for over 2 years." Riley scoffed, but Dylan leaned forward with interest as Lewis reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn notebook. The pages were filled with newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and maps with red markings. "This entire area," Lewis explained, pointing to a triangular region marked on his map, "is what some locals call the Stone Triangle. Your grandparents weren't the first to vanish here. I've documented at least 7 other disappearances over the last decade, all with similar characteristics. Experienced outdoors people, no distress calls, vehicles found abandoned or not found at all." Dylan's stomach tightened as he studied the map. The location of his grandparents' motorhome sat almost dead center in the triangle Lewis had outlined. "Why haven't I heard about these other disappearances?" Dylan asked. Lewis shrugged. "Most were solo hikers or couples without family to keep searching. The cases went cold, filed away as unfortunate wilderness accidents." Riley shook his head dismissively. "Every region has its share of missing hikers. People underestimate the terrain, run out of water, make bad decisions. Nothing paranormal about it." "Maybe," Lewis conceded. "But why do the disappearances cluster in this specific area? And why are bodies never recovered?" The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Dylan stood abruptly, walking to the edge of the campsite where he pulled out his phone. To his surprise, a single bar of reception flickered on his screen. He quickly checked his voicemail, listening to his mother's increasingly worried messages. The final message, however, wasn't a plea for him to return home. Jennifer's voice sounded different, hesitant, almost reluctant. "Dylan, I've been going through some old boxes since your call. I found something the police returned years ago that I'd forgotten about. Pages from your grandmother's journal that they found in their house after they disappeared. I never read them closely before. It was too painful. But given what you think you've found, maybe they're important. I'm scanning and sending them to you now. Please be careful, honey." Dylan's phone pinged with an incoming email. He downloaded the attachments slowly, the weak signal threatening to cut out at any moment. When the images finally loaded, he found himself looking at photocopies of his grandmother's distinctive handwriting. The pages appeared to be from the months leading up to their final trip. Most entries were mundane, notes about gardening, book club meetings, doctor's appointments for Harold. But scattered throughout were references to a secret trail Harold had become fixated on exploring, and Martha's enigmatic concerns about his health. One entry in particular caught Dylan's attention. "Harold insists we try to find the passage he read about in that old journal from the university archives. I worry about him taking on such a challenging hike, especially with his recent episodes. But he's more animated than I've seen him in months. Perhaps this final adventure is what he needs." Dylan scrolled further, finding an entry dated just 3 days before they disappeared. "Coordinates confirmed with Harold's calculations. He's packed and repacked our gear 3 times already. I've never seen him so focused on anything. I pray this trip brings him the peace he's seeking, though I can't shake this feeling of unease." Walking back to the campfire, Dylan found Riley and Lewis in a tense standoff, the former ranger clearly skeptical of everything the self-proclaimed investigator was saying. "My mother just sent me something," Dylan interrupted, holding up his phone. "Pages from my grandmother's journal that the police found but apparently didn't think were important. He showed them the images, pointing out the relevant entries. Lewis listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in his own journal, while Riley maintained his skeptical expression. This mention of episodes and her concern about a challenging hike, Dillon said. It never came up in the police investigation. Everyone described my grandfather as being in perfect health. People hide things, Riley said simply. Especially the elderly. Pride gets in the way. Lewis was focusing on a different detail. Does she mention the specific coordinates anywhere? That could confirm if we're heading in the right direction. Dillon scrolled through the images again, stopping at what appeared to be a roughly sketched map with numbers scribbled in the margins. Here, he said, enlarging the image. These look like coordinates. Riley took the phone, studying the numbers with a frown. These are very precise. Your grandfather must have been using high-grade topographical maps or early GPS. Dillon took back the phone, comparing the coordinates in the journal with those from the satellite image of the motorhome. His blood ran cold as he realized they matched almost exactly. They're the same, he whispered. The coordinates my grandmother wrote down 5 years ago match exactly where the motorhome is now visible on satellite imagery. That's impossible, Riley said, grabbing the phone to verify. Those imaging satellites weren't even in orbit 5 years ago. The resolution wasn't good enough to spot a vehicle that size. Unless, Lewis interjected, eyes wide with excitement, they knew exactly where they were going, and whatever they found there was exactly what they were looking for. Dillon stared at the journal pages, a new understanding dawning. His grandparents hadn't gotten lost at all. They had deliberately sought out this remote location for some purpose. The police investigation had completely missed this connection, treating the disappearance as an unfortunate accident rather than a planned expedition. My grandmother knew, Dillon said quietly. She wrote down exactly where they were heading, and nobody made the connection. The implications were staggering. If his grandparents had intentionally traveled to those precise coordinates, what had they found there? And why had they never returned? In the distance, a faint rumble of thunder broke the silence. Riley looked up at the previously clear sky, now showing the first signs of cloud cover moving in from the west. We need to get moving at first light, he said grimly. There's a storm coming, and if those coordinates are right, we've got a lot of ground to cover before it hits. Dillon couldn't sleep that night, his mind racing with possibilities. He studied his grandmother's journal entries until the battery on his phone died, trying to find any additional clues in her careful handwriting. By the time dawn broke, bringing with it the distant lightning flashes of an approaching storm, he had reached a chilling conclusion. His grandparents had known exactly where they were going, but they might not have known what awaited them there. My grandmother knew exactly where they were going, Dillon whispered, looking at the horizon where the first lightning flashes illuminated the approaching storm clouds. The lightning flashed across the darkening sky as Dillon studied the trio of weather apps on his phone. All showed the same alarming pattern, a massive storm system moving directly toward them, far faster than originally predicted. He showed the screen to Riley, who cursed under his breath. We need to move, Riley said, already packing up their makeshift camp. That system's accelerated overnight. Based on these coordinates, we've got less than 24 hours before these ravines turn into death traps. Lewis, who had spent the night at their camp under Riley's watchful eye, quickly gathered his own gear. Flash floods in this region can rise 20 feet in minutes, he added. The geology here creates natural funnels. Dillon shouldered his pack, wincing at the weight of his camera equipment. Despite the danger ahead, he couldn't bear to leave it behind. These might be the most important photographs he'd ever take. The Jeep was already parked at the furthest point, accessible by vehicle. From here on, they would be on foot. The terrain grew steadily more challenging as they hiked. What had started as a relatively flat desert trail quickly transformed into a series of steep switchbacks descending into the canyon. Riley led the way with practiced efficiency, occasionally stopping to consult both the physical map and the GPS coordinates. Dylan noticed Lewis frequently lagging behind, ostensibly to take notes or examine rock formations, but the small red recording light on his backpack strap didn't escape Dylan's attention. 3 hours into their hike, Dylan stopped abruptly in the middle of a narrow path, his eyes unfocused, his breathing shallow. For a terrifying moment, he didn't recognize his surroundings or remember why he was there. The sensation passed almost as quickly as it had come, leaving him disoriented and frightened. "You okay?" Riley asked, turning back with a concerned expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Dylan blinked rapidly, forcing himself back to the present. "I'm fine," he lied. "Just tired. Didn't sleep much." This wasn't the first time he'd experienced these momentary lapses. They'd started about a year after his grandparents disappeared. Brief, terrifying episodes where his mind simply disconnected. His doctor had suggested they were stress-related, but Dylan harbored a deeper fear. He'd seen his grandfather experience similar moments of confusion in the months before their final trip, moments the family had attributed to simple absent-mindedness. The group continued downward, the canyon walls rising around them like ancient sentinels. The path occasionally disappeared entirely, forcing them to scramble over loose rock and through thorny brush. By midday, they'd reached a small plateau that offered a brief respite and a sweeping view of the landscape ahead. "We're making good time," Riley announced, passing a Deer canteen to Dylan. "Another 5 hours should put us within a mile of the coordinates, assuming the terrain cooperates." As Dylan drank, Lewis approached, his expression unusually animated. "I just got a call through on my satellite phone," he said excitedly. "My producer loves the concept for this episode. Imagine the title, 'The Mystery of Dylan Wilson's Missing Grandparents Finally Solved.' We're talking major streaming potential here." Dylan nearly choked on his water. "Your what?" Lewis's enthusiasm faltered slightly. "My podcast, Mysteries Unearthed. I mentioned it last night, didn't I?" "You said you were an investigator," Dylan said slowly, a cold anger building inside him. "You never mentioned recording any of this." Lewis backpedaled physically and verbally. "It's all part of the investigation process. Documentation is crucial, and sharing these stories helps fund the research. I've been recording our journey since—" He didn't finish the sentence. Dylan lunged forward, grabbing Lewis by his jacket and pushing him dangerously close to the plateau's edge. "You've been secretly filming us? Turning my grandparents' disappearance into entertainment?" Lewis's eyes widened with genuine fear as he glanced down at the 40-foot drop behind him. "It's not like that. I'm helping bring attention to their case. The more people who know, the better chance." "That's enough," Riley shouted, forcefully separating them. "Both of you. This is exactly how people die out here. Stupid arguments and poor decisions." He turned to Lewis. "Turn off whatever recording equipment you have right now, or I'm confiscating it." The tension hung in the air like the approaching storm clouds. Dylan stepped back, trembling with rage and something else. Another momentary lapse had flickered at the edges of his consciousness during his confrontation with Lewis. He'd lost a few seconds, finding himself with his hands gripping Lewis's jacket without fully remembering grabbing him. These episodes were becoming more frequent, a realization that terrified him. As they continued their descent, the sky darkened ominously. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the wind picked up, bringing with it the distant smell of rain. Riley increased their pace, his experience translating into a palpable sense of urgency that infected even Lewis, who had fallen into a chastened silence. "Look there," Riley called out, pointing to a small clearing about 100 yards ahead. "Someone's been camping here, and not that long ago." The site contained the blackened remains of multiple campfires arranged in a rough circle. Unlike typical hikers' camps, these fire pits seemed permanent, built with carefully arranged stones and protected from the wind by strategic rock placements. Riley crouched by one of the pits, rubbing ash between his fingers. "These don't belong to regular campers or registered trail hikers," he concluded. "The arrangement is all wrong, and there's no attempt to minimize impact. Someone's been living out here, hidden." Lewis, apparently unable to contain himself despite the earlier confrontation, began taking photos with his phone. "This could be evidence of your community," he said to Dylan, referencing a theory he'd shared the previous night about people choosing to live off-grid in the canyon's remote areas. Dylan was about to respond when another disorienting episode hit him. Stronger this time. The world seemed to shift around him, colors bleeding into one another. He found himself sitting on a rock with no memory of having moved there, Riley kneeling in front of him with a concerned expression. "Hear me? Dylan, you with us?" Riley was saying, his voice seeming to come from far away. Dylan nodded weakly, the world slowly resolving itself back to normal. "Sorry, just got dizzy for a second." Riley offered a water bottle. "You need to tell me if you're not well. Out here, hidden medical issues kill as surely as falls or floods." They resumed, their journey with Riley keeping a closer eye on Dylan. The path narrowed further, winding between towering rock formations that blocked much of the increasingly threatening sky. After another hour of difficult hiking, they rounded a final bend, and Riley signaled a halt. "There," he said quietly, pointing to a small clearing ahead. The brown and white motorhome sat in a natural depression, partially shielded from aerial view by overhanging rock and years of accumulated desert plants. The vehicle looked remarkably intact from a distance, though clearly damaged on the driver's side, as if it had been struck or had gone off the road. Dylan's heart hammered in his chest. After 5 years of searching, of being dismissed as obsessed or delusional, the physical proof of his grandparents' journey lay before him. He moved forward almost in a trance, barely aware of Riley cautioning him to proceed carefully. The clearing around the motorhome showed signs of habitation. A makeshift clothesline, carefully stacked firewood, and a small garden plot with what appeared to be desert-adapted vegetation. As they approached the vehicle itself, the extent of the damage became more apparent. The driver's side had a significant impact dent, and one of the wheels was missing entirely, the axle supported by carefully placed rocks. "Someone's been maintaining this place," Riley observed, examining the perimeter. "And not that long ago." Inside the motorhome, time seemed to have both stopped and continued. A fine layer of dust covered everything, but personal belongings remained largely as they must have been left. Clothes in the small closet, maps spread on the dining table, even prescription bottles lined up neatly in the bathroom cabinet. Most tellingly, there were signs of recent use. Freshly washed dishes in the small sink, a partially used candle, and several empty food cans that showed no significant rust or aging. "Someone's been using this place," Riley confirmed, examining the food, supplies. "Recently consumed within the last few days, I'd guess." Dylan moved through the space in a daze, touching his grandparents' belongings with reverent fingers. He recognized Harold's favorite flannel shirt hanging on a hook, Martha's hand-knitted throw draped over the small sofa. Photos of the family were still displayed on the walls and small shelves, including several of Dylan himself at various ages. While Dylan explored the living area, Lewis began methodically examining the motorhome's storage compartments, surreptitiously pocketing small items, a compass, a handwritten note, what appeared to be a prescription bottle. Dylan caught him in the act. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lewis clutched the items defensively. "Collecting evidence for documentation. These could provide crucial clues." "Those aren't yours to take," Dylan shouted, lunging for the items. Lewis backpedaled, knocking into the small kitchenette counter and sending dishes clattering to the floor. The argument escalated quickly into a physical struggle, with Dylan attempting to recover the items and Lewis insisting on their value as evidence for his podcast. Riley moved to intervene, just as a deafening metallic groan reverberated through the motorhome. The vehicle shifted perceptibly, tilting toward the driver's side. Outside, the first heavy raindrops began to pound the metal roof. "The ground's eroding," Riley shouted. "The rain's destabilizing the clearing. Grab what's important and get out now." In the chaotic scramble that followed, Dylan made a split-second decision. While Riley and Lewis gathered the most obvious supplies and evidence, he dropped to his knees and checked beneath the driver's seat, a hiding place his grandfather had always used for important documents. His fingers closed around a leather-bound book. Martha's complete journal, not just the few pages the police had found at their home. Clutching it to his chest, Dylan followed the others outside just as the, motorhome shifted again, sliding several feet toward the edge of the ravine. In the relative safety of a nearby rock outcropping, protected somewhat from the increasing rain, Dylan opened the journal with trembling hands. He flipped to the final entries, scanning his grandmother's familiar handwriting until a passage made his blood run cold. "Harold didn't recognize my face today for the third time this week. The doctor said early-onset Alzheimer's. How can I take this final adventure from him? He doesn't want anyone to know, especially Dylan." As the implications of this revelation washed over him, Dylan became aware of movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure in a rain poncho stood observing them silently, before quickly disappearing into the forest as the rain intensified dramatically. The cloaked figure vanished into the downpour as thunder cracked overhead, shaking the ground beneath them. Dylan clutched the journal to his chest, the revelation about his grandfather's condition still reverberating through his mind, more forcefully than the storm itself. The rain transformed from heavy drops to sheets of water in seconds, cascading down the canyon walls and turning the dusty ground into treacherous mud. "We need shelter now," Riley shouted over the deluge, pointing toward a rock overhang about 50 yards away. "That motorhome's going to slide completely any minute." The three men made a desperate dash through the strengthening storm, slipping and sliding on the rapidly deteriorating ground. They reached the overhang just as a terrible groaning sound echoed through the canyon, the motorhome shifting further toward the edge, its decades-old frame protesting against the forces of nature. Under the relative protection of the stone, Riley assessed their situation with grim efficiency. "The trail we came in on will be underwater within hours. We're completely cut off." He pulled out his topographical map, now speckled with raindrops despite his efforts to keep it dry. "The entire landscape is changing with this erosion. I can't guarantee I can navigate us out the way we came." Dylan barely registered Riley's words, his attention fixed on Martha's journal. He turned the pages with careful fingers, searching for more information about Harold's condition and any clues about their final days. The journal contained entries spanning the 6 months before their disappearance, each one revealing more about Harold's deteriorating mental state and Martha's increasing concern. One entry particularly caught his attention. Harold spent all night talking about the hidden community again. He's convinced that his research proved they exist, people who've chosen to disappear from modern society. I thought it was just an interesting historical footnote for his book, but he's become fixated on finding them. Perhaps it's a way for him to maintain mental engagement as the episodes worsen. Lewis, attempting to establish contact via his satellite phone, cursed softly as the device failed to connect. The canyon walls plus this storm, we're in a complete dead zone. No one's going to be looking for us anytime soon. "Your podcast fans won't miss you?" Dylan asked with bitter sarcasm. "I'm supposed to upload every 3 days," Lewis admitted, ignoring the tone. "When I miss the schedule, my producer might alert someone, but that could be days from now." The rain continued unabated, transforming the dry stream bed below them into a churning river within hours. The temperature dropped as night approached, forcing the three men to huddle closer together for warmth. Dylan found himself rereading the same journal entries repeatedly, trying to piece together the puzzle of his grandparents' final journey. Near midnight, as Lewis and Riley dozed fitfully, Dylan experienced another episode, the worst yet. One moment he was reading by flashlight, and the next he found himself standing at the edge of their shelter, rain soaking his clothes with no memory of having moved. The disorientation was complete, terrifying. When his awareness fully returned, he found Riley watching him with concern. "How long have you been having these episodes?" Riley asked quietly, guiding Dylan back under the overhang. Dylan sank down against the rock wall, shivering from both cold and fear. "They started about a year after my grandparents disappeared. Doctor said it was stress-related dissociation. But what if it's early symptoms? What if I'm developing what my grandfather had?" Riley considered this. "I've seen Alzheimer's up close. My father had it. These episodes of yours seem different." "But what if they're not?" Dylan's voice cracked. "What if it's genetic? What if I'm already losing myself the way he did?" The former ranger had no comforting answer to offer. Instead, he studied the weather patterns visible in the sporadic lightning flashes, his expression calculating. "Storm's intensity is cycling. We'll have a brief window around dawn when the rain should lighten. If you're still determined to follow this through, that's our chance to check those final coordinates from the journal." As predicted, the rain diminished to a light drizzle shortly after first light. The landscape had been transformed overnight. New waterfalls streamed down rock faces that had been bone dry the day before, and their original trail had indeed disappeared beneath a torrent of muddy water. Dylan studied the map alongside the journal's final entries. According to this, they were heading to a specific rock formation about a half-mile further in. Martha mentions it as the doorway several times. "You sure you're up for this?" Riley asked, clearly concerned about Dylan's physical and mental state. "I have to know," Dylan replied simply. The decision was made. Riley would stay at their makeshift camp to secure what remained of their supplies and attempt to establish a signal with their emergency beacon. Dylan would follow the coordinates to the final location marked in Martha's journal, promising to return within 3 hours regardless of what he found. What went unspoken was Lewis's role, but as Dylan prepared to leave, the podcaster approached him with an unexpected gesture of goodwill. "Take this," he said, offering a small but powerful emergency flashlight. "Better than what you've got. Just be careful out there." The terrain beyond their shelter was almost unrecognizable after the night's deluge. Dylan picked his way carefully along a newly formed ridge, using his photographer's eye to identify the least treacherous path forward. The coordinates led him upward along the canyon wall rather than deeper into the basin, which explained why this particular area might have remained survivable during flash floods. After 40 minutes of difficult climbing, Dylan reached a narrow ledge that curved around a massive sandstone outcropping. The journal had described this exact formation, like a sentinel guarding the secret beyond. His heart raced as he followed the ledge to its conclusion, where a dark opening in the rock face revealed itself, a cave entrance, partially hidden by hanging vegetation. Signs of human passage were unmistakable. The dirt at the entrance showed footprints preserved from the rain by the overhanging rock, and small cairns, stacked stones, typically used as trail markers, lined the approach. Dylan activated the flashlight and stepped cautiously into the cave. The beam revealed a surprisingly large chamber extending backward into the cliff. Along the walls were shelves carved directly into the stone, holding various supplies, tools, and personal items. A small cooking area had been established near a natural chimney in the rock, and bedding materials were neatly arranged in the driest corner. Most strikingly, photographs were pinned to a corkboard, mounted on a relatively flat section of wall. Family photos similar to those in the motorhome, but also landscapes, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps. As Dylan moved deeper into the cave to examine these items, a sharp sound behind him was his only warning before something hard struck the back of his head. He stumbled forward, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the cave floor, its beam creating disorienting shadows as it moved. Dylan spun around, dazed but still conscious, raising his arms to defend against his unseen attacker. In the dim, reflected light, he could make out a figure rushing toward him. They collided in the semi-darkness, grappling awkwardly in the confined space. "You can't take him back!" the attacker shouted, voice echoing off the stone walls. "He wouldn't survive out there!" Dylan managed to break free momentarily, diving for the flashlight. His fingers closed around it just as his attacker lunged again. Rolling onto his back, Dylan raised the light directly into the face of his assailant. The beam illuminated features that made Dylan's blood freeze. Before him stood an elderly man with a wild white beard and weathered face. Despite the years and changes, there was something hauntingly familiar in the bone structure, in the set of the shoulders, features that resembled his grandfather Harold, yet different in unsettling ways. The man shielded his eyes from the light, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "What are you doing in my home?" Before Dylan could respond, a new light source appeared at the cave entrance. Lewis stood there, camera in hand, the small recording light glowing red in the darkness. "This is incredible," Lewis whispered, advancing into the cave with his camera raised. "We've found him. We've actually found Harold Wilson." The elderly man reacted with immediate panic at the sight of the camera, backing away rapidly toward the deeper recesses of the cave. "Martha," he cried out, genuine terror in his voice. "Martha, there are strangers. Help me." Dylan scrambled to his feet, pursuing the retreating figure. "Grandpa, is that really you?" "It's me, Dylan." The chase led them deeper into the cave, which opened into a larger chamber where several passages branched off. Dylan followed the sound of the man's frightened calls, only to find himself suddenly surrounded by multiple figures emerging from the shadows, some holding makeshift weapons. "Stop right there," commanded a stern female voice from behind the group. The crowd parted, and a woman stepped forward. Though her hair had turned completely white and her face bore many more lines than in Dylan's memories, there was no mistaking her identity. "Dylan?" she gasped, lowering the walking stick she had been holding defensively. "My God, is it really you?" Martha Wilson stood before him, aged beyond her years, but unmistakably his grandmother. She held the hand of the confused man Dylan had been chasing, who now looked at him with complete non-recognition. "Your grandfather doesn't know who you are," she said with quiet resignation. "He barely knows who I am most days." The shock of this reunion froze Dylan in place. After 5 years of searching, of being dismissed as obsessed and delusional, here stood the living proof that his instincts had been correct all along. But before he could process this moment, before he could even step forward to embrace his grandmother, a deafening cracking sound reverberated through the cave. The entrance they had come through collapsed in a shower of rock and mud, the weight of the saturated ground above finally giving way. Dust filled the air as darkness enveloped them completely, the cave entrance sealed by tons of debris, cutting them off from Riley, who had remained outside. The thunderous collapse sent shockwaves through the chamber as dust and debris choked the air. Dylan instinctively shielded Martha from falling rocks, his arms embracing the grandmother he'd searched for across 5 long years. As the rumbling subsided and the dust began to settle, the reality of their situation emerged in the dim glow of Lewis's camera light. They were trapped. "Everyone stay calm," called out a steadying voice from the shadows. A tall, lean man with silver hair stepped forward, taking charge with quiet authority. "Check for injuries, then we'll assess the damage." Martha gently extricated herself from Dylan's embrace, turning immediately to Harold, who stood trembling in confusion. "It's just thunder, dear," she soothed, though they all knew it was far worse. "Everything's fine. I'm right here with you." Dylan watched in stunned silence as several people, He counted at least 10, moved with practiced efficiency in the near darkness. Someone lit an oil lamp, then another, gradually illuminating a space that defied belief. The cave opening had merely been an antechamber to something far more extensive, a network of chambers where signs of long-term habitation were everywhere. Rough-hewn furniture, storage areas with preserved foods, sleeping quarters separated by hanging fabrics, and even a small spring trickling from the rock wall into a stone basin. "This way," Martha said, leading Dylan and Lewis deeper into the main chamber while others examined the collapsed entrance. "We should sit and talk while they determine if there's another way out." The central area featured a circle of simple chairs and cushions around a stone fire pit with a cleverly designed chimney disappearing into the ceiling. Harold was gently guided to a seat by a middle-aged woman who spoke to him with familiar kindness. He accepted a cup of water, his earlier panic already forgotten, replaced by a childlike docility that broke Dylan's heart. "When I realized bringing him back would only make him more confused and frightened, I made the hardest decision of my life," Martha explained once they were seated, her weathered hand reaching out to take Dylan's. "Out here, he has peace. There are no expectations to remember, no judgments when he confuses names or faces." Lewis, who had been filming discreetly from a few feet away, slowly lowered his camera. His expression had transformed from opportunistic excitement to something more contemplative. He switched off the recording light with a decisive click. "This is bigger than any podcast," he murmured, the realization evident in his voice. Dylan could barely process the reality before him. "All this time, you've been alive, living here, while we mourned, while we searched." His voice broke. "Mom held a memorial service. She gave up. I never did, but even I never imagined." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I sent a postcard once. I thought it would be enough to let you know we were alive, without revealing where. I couldn't risk someone bringing Harold back to a world that would destroy what remained of him." The silver-haired man approached their circle, his expression grave. "The entrance is completely sealed. There's no way to clear it with the tools we have." He gestured toward the far side of the cave. "Our emergency exit route may still be viable, but it involves a narrow tunnel and a section that's partially submerged even in dry conditions. With this storm," he glanced toward Harold, the implication clear. Dylan noticed water beginning to seep in through cracks in the lower wall, forming small rivulets across the cave floor. "It's going to flood in here, isn't it?" he asked. "Eventually, yes," the man acknowledged. "I'm Samuel, by the way. I founded this community 20 years ago." As if on cue, a younger man rushed in from one of the side passages. "The water level in the lower tunnel is rising fast. If we're going to evacuate, it needs to be within the hour." A tense discussion erupted among the community members. Martha remained steadfast. "I won't leave without Harold. If he can't make the journey, I stay too." Dylan studied his grandfather, who sat contentedly arranging small stones and patterns, oblivious to the life-or-death conversation happening around him. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Dylan. He'd spent years searching for his grandparents, only to find them in a situation where rescue might be impossible. Drawing on his professional background, Dylan removed his waterproof camera bag and extracted his equipment. "I might be able to help," he offered. "My flash systems can provide strong, consistent light, and I have waterproof casings we could use to protect essential supplies." Under Dylan's direction, they created an impromptu lighting system that illuminated the potential escape route more effectively than their scavenged lamps. As they worked, the community revealed more about themselves: former professionals, artists, and even a doctor who had chosen to disappear from society for various reasons. Some were escaping abusive situations. Others had terminal diagnoses they preferred to face on their own terms, and some, like Samuel, simply rejected modern society's values. As Dylan tested the light configuration in one of the narrower passages, the world suddenly tilted around him. Colors blurred, sounds became distant, and he found himself sitting against the wall with no memory of how he got there. Martha knelt before him, concern etched deep in her face. "Another episode?" she asked softly, helping him drink from a water flask. When his senses cleared, Dylan looked at her in confusion. "You know about these?" Martha nodded, taking his hands in hers. "It's not Alzheimer's, Dylan. You've had dissociative episodes since you were a child, when your parents divorced. It's a defense mechanism that intensifies under extreme stress. Your grandfather noticed it when you were little and always feared you'd believe you had the same condition he did." The revelation washed over Dylan like a physical wave, providing both profound relief and a new understanding of himself. All these years, he'd feared he was showing early signs of the same disease that had taken his grandfather's mind. The weight of that fear had been almost as heavy as the grief of loss. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "The doctors just called it stress-related." "Because it manifested differently as you grew older," Martha explained. "When you were a child, you'd simply go quiet, seem to check out for a while. As an adult, the episodes became more complex. Your mother probably didn't connect them to those childhood moments." Water continued rising steadily along the cave floor, now nearly ankle-deep in the lowest areas. Samuel returned with 3 volunteers who had scouted the escape tunnel. "The situation is worse than we feared," he reported. "The tunnel narrows significantly about 30 meters in, and the water level there is already chest-high. We'd need to partially swim through a section with only a few inches of airspace above." Martha looked at Harold, who remained blissfully unaware of their predicament. "He would panic," she said softly. "He doesn't understand where he is half the time. Underwater in darkness. It would be cruel." A middle-aged woman with cropped gray hair stepped forward. "I was a nurse before I came here," she said. "I still have some medications in my supplies. We could administer a mild sedative, enough to keep him calm during the journey without endangering him." Martha hesitated, clearly torn by the decision. Dylan watched her internal struggle, understanding for the first time the weight of choices she'd been making for years, each one balanced between preserving Harold's dignity and ensuring his safety. After a long moment, Martha nodded her consent. The former nurse disappeared into one of the side chambers, returning with a small medical kit. With gentle efficiency, she prepared a syringe while Martha spoke soothingly to Harold. "This will help you rest, my love," Martha whispered, holding his hand as the nurse administered the injection. "When you wake up, we'll be somewhere safe and dry." Dylan watched as his grandfather's eyelids grew heavy, his rambling words slowing until he drifted into peaceful unconsciousness. For a brief moment, before he succumbed to the sedative, Harold had looked directly at Martha with perfect clarity, squeezing her hand with recognition. A fleeting window into the man he had once been. The evacuation preparations accelerated as the water continued to rise. The community gathered only essential supplies, medical equipment, irreplaceable documents, and minimal food. 4 strong members were designated to carry Harold on an improvised stretcher. Dylan used his photographer's rope and carabiners to create a safety system for the most treacherous sections. Lewis, who had remained unusually quiet, approached Dylan as they prepared to enter the tunnel. "I've been documenting stories for years without really understanding them," he admitted, helping an elderly community member secure a waterproof pack. "This is the first time I've truly seen the humanity behind the mystery." As they formed a line at the tunnel entrance, Dylan attempted to establish communication with Riley by tapping rhythmically on the cave walls, percussion techniques he'd learned in a wilderness photography course years ago. To everyone's surprise, after several attempts, faint answering taps echoed back. "He's alive out there," Dylan announced, hope rising in his voice. "And he understood my signal. He's trying to find another way to reach us." The silver-haired leader surveyed their assembled group, water now swirling around their calves. "We need to move now," he announced with urgent finality as a distant rumble indicated new instability in the cave structure. "Or none of us will make it out of here alive. We need to go now." Samuel's urgent declaration echoed through the chamber as a distant rumble vibrated through the stone, sending a cascade of pebbles from the ceiling. The water had risen to their ankles, its cold embrace a constant reminder of their dwindling time. Dylan pressed his ear against the damp cave wall, concentrating on the faint pattern of taps coming from the other side. "It's definitely Riley," he confirmed, relief washing over his face. "He's using a simplified Morse code, just like I taught him." Martha watched with a mixture of pride and concern as her grandson grabbed a fist-sized rock and began responding with his own sequence of precisely timed taps. Dylan's forehead creased with concentration, his photographer's sense of timing proving unexpectedly valuable in this life-or-death situation. "He says he's found another potential opening about 50 meters north of the collapsed entrance," Dylan translated after a lengthy exchange. "It's partially blocked, but he thinks it connects to one of these side chambers if we can identify which one." Samuel nodded, immediately dispatching 2 of his people to investigate the northern passages. The community moved with the coordinated efficiency of those accustomed to facing challenges together, each person assuming their role without hesitation. Harold's unconscious form had been secured to the improvised stretcher, his peaceful expression a stark contrast to the tension surrounding him. While the others prepared for potential evacuation through either route, Martha guided Dylan to a relatively dry corner where they could speak privately. She settled beside Harold, gently brushing white hair from his forehead with a tenderness that spoke volumes of their decades together. When his mind began to fail, "You were one of the last people he forgot," Martha said softly, her weathered hand finding Dylan's. "He would have good days when he remembered everything and everyone. Then gradually, those days became less frequent." Dylan's eyes filled with unexpected tears as he studied his grandfather's face. "All these years, I've been searching for answers, convinced there was some conspiracy or accident. I never imagined that we chose to disappear." Martha finished for him, her smile sad but resolute. "It wasn't the plan when we started that final trip. Harold was having more good days than bad then. He was excited about finding this community he'd researched for years. When we had the accident with the motorhome, these people found us. Harold had a severe episode after the crash, the worst I'd ever seen. He didn't know me, didn't know where we were. He was terrified." She paused, looking around at the cave that had become their home. "The community took us in. After a few weeks, I realized that bringing him back to our old life would be cruel. Here, his confusion didn't matter. Nobody expected him to remember anything. He could just be." Dylan's gaze drifted to the photographs on the makeshift corkboard, images of his family alongside pictures of people he'd never met, all preserved in this hidden sanctuary. "Your dissociation episodes," Martha continued, her eyes studying him with maternal concern. "They got worse after we disappeared, didn't they?" The question struck Dylan with unexpected force. He'd never connected the timing, how the blank episodes had intensified in the months following his grandparents' vanishing. "Sometimes I'd find myself standing in your kitchen," he admitted. "I'd drive to your house without consciously deciding to, then snap back to awareness standing there, staring at the empty rooms." Martha squeezed his hand. "The mind protects itself in strange ways. Harold's illness took his memories. Your episodes were your mind taking brief escapes from painful reality." Their conversation was interrupted by the undeniable sound of water rushing faster into the chamber. The level had risen noticeably in just the few minutes they'd been talking, now lapping around their calves. From the northern passage, excited voices echoed as the scouts returned. "We found it!" called one of the women, water streaming from her clothes. There's a narrow chimney that seems to align with the sounds from outside. We can see a patch of lighter darkness that might be an opening Riley is creating. Samuel quickly reorganized their evacuation plan, directing half the group to begin moving toward the northern passage, while the rest continued preparing the original escape route as a backup. The water's rising pace added urgency to their movements, the storm above clearly intensifying again. Dylan rejoined the efforts, using his technical knowledge of light and shadow to help identify the safest path through the partially flooded northern chimney. As he worked, a burst of dizziness nearly sent him stumbling into the water. The familiar disorientation washed over him, colors blurring, sounds becoming distant and hollow. When clarity returned seconds later, he found Martha watching him with knowing eyes. "You're learning to recognize them now," she observed. "That's good, Dylan. Knowing your limits is the first step to overcoming them." The observation struck Dylan profoundly. All these years, he'd feared these episodes as harbingers of mental decline, of following his grandfather into the fog of Alzheimer's. Martha's perspective transformed them into something he could potentially manage, rather than simply fear. Lewis, who had been helping an elderly community member secure her few possessions in waterproof wrapping, approached Dylan with an unexpected humility. "For years I've documented stories without understanding them," he confessed, his ever-present camera now hanging unused at his side. "I thought mysteries were puzzles to be solved for an audience. I never considered the human cost of exposing them." Before Dylan could respond, a resonant series of taps echoed through the chamber, louder and more urgent than before. Dylan rushed to the wall, pressing his ear against the cool stone as he interpreted Riley's message. "He's broken through," Dylan announced. "There's a small opening, but he says the storm is intensifying rapidly above. The ground is becoming more unstable. We need to move now." The community mobilized immediately. Samuel directed 4 strong members to carefully maneuver Harold's stretcher toward the northern passage. The former nurse checked his sedation, ensuring he would remain calm during the potentially traumatic journey ahead. As they reached the narrow chimney that would hopefully lead to freedom, a sobering reality became clear. The passage grew exceptionally tight in places. Harold's stretcher would be a significant challenge to navigate through the constricted spaces. "We'll need to modify how we carry him," Samuel decided, examining the narrowest section, "and move in smaller groups to prevent bottlenecks." While the others reconfigured the stretcher, Dylan and Martha paused in the last relatively spacious chamber. Dylan retrieved a small photograph that had fallen from the evacuation supplies, an image of himself as a teenager with his grandparents standing proudly in front of the Grand Canyon. "All these years," Dylan said, studying the photo, "I thought you were lost or gone. I couldn't move forward without knowing." Martha's eyes softened with both regret and resolve. "I sent a signal early on. That postcard with no return address. I hoped you would understand we were okay. Just gone." "The Monument Valley postcard," Dylan murmured, the memory suddenly crystal clear. "Mom said it was impossible, but I always believed it was from you." Their moment of connection was interrupted by a sharp series of taps from beyond the chimney, Riley's signal growing more urgent. The message, when Dylan decoded it, sent a chill through the group. The opening was beginning to destabilize as the saturated ground shifted. In the dim light of their improvised lamps, Dylan used his expertise with shadow and light to identify the safest path through the chimney. "If we angle the strongest light source from below," he demonstrated, "we can see the structural weaknesses in the passage." The evacuation began in earnest, with the more able-bodied community members going first to help from the other side. Progress was agonizingly slow, each person having to navigate sections where the chimney narrowed to barely shoulder width. Dylan insisted on staying with the final group that would transport Harold, working alongside Martha to ensure his grandfather's safety. As they waited for their turn, Harold's eyes fluttered open briefly, a moment of startling clarity crossing his features. "Dylan," he murmured, reaching out a trembling hand. "You've grown so much since those photos at the Grand Canyon." The recognition struck Dylan like a physical blow. "Grandpa, you remember me?" Harold's smile was tired but genuine. "Of course I remember. You wanted to photograph every rock formation. You were only 17 then." Martha and Dylan exchanged shocked glances, both recognizing the precious gift of this moment, a brief window of lucidity that might close at any second. Dylan took his grandfather's hand, fighting back tears as Harold continued speaking with surprising coherence. "Your photographs," Harold said, his voice stronger than it had been. "They always captured what others missed. The light between things, not just the things themselves." For several precious minutes, Harold reminisced about their trips together, about Dylan's early passion for photography, about specific moments Martha had thought long lost to the disease. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the clarity began to fade, Harold's words becoming more confused, his gaze less focused. The moment of connection ended, just as Samuel returned with news from the front of the evacuation line. "Riley has managed to widen the opening significantly. We're moving people through now, but we need to hurry." As they prepared to transport Harold through the chimney, a deep, ominous rumble echoed through the cave system. The sound was different from before, deeper, more sustained, and was followed by the unmistakable rush of water surging through stone passages. "We need to go now," announced Samuel with urgent finality, when a distant thunder indicated new instability in the cave structure. "Or none of us will make it out of here alive." The rumble grew louder as Samuel's warning echoed through the cave system. With the water now reaching their knees, the evacuation transformed from urgent to desperate. The community members formed a human chain, passing supplies through the narrow chimney, while 4 men carefully maneuvered Harold's sedated form onto a modified stretcher constructed from backpack frames and waterproof canvas. "We'll need to move him vertically through the narrowest section," Samuel instructed, securing the final straps. "Dylan, your climbing equipment might help us here." Dylan quickly unfastened his camera bag, extracting climbing ropes and carabiners he'd packed for the canyon expedition. His hands worked with practiced efficiency despite the tremor of anxiety that ran through them. "We can create a pulley system through this section," he suggested, attaching the gear to natural projections in the rock. "It'll distribute his weight more evenly and give us better control." Martha stood beside her husband, reluctant to leave his side even for a moment. "I should go first," she insisted. "I need to be there when he comes through." Samuel shook his head firmly. "We need stronger people on both sides of the narrow passage. You'll go after the first team establishes the receiving position." The evacuation proceeded with methodical urgency, each person disappearing into the chimney one by one. The water continued rising, now reaching mid-thigh on those still waiting. Dylan felt the cold seeping into his bones, yet the physical discomfort hardly registered against the emotional tumult of finding his grandparents alive after 5 years, only to face losing them again to the flood. When Martha's turn came, she squeezed Dylan's hand with surprising strength. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I'm grateful you found us, that you never gave up." The narrow tunnel proved even more challenging than anticipated. Dylan, positioned at the rear of Harold's transport team, could hear grunts and strained instructions echoing through the stone passage as the 4 men navigated the unconscious form through increasingly tight confines. The sedative had kept Harold peacefully unaware, a small mercy in this harrowing journey. Halfway through the passage, they encountered the first underwater section. The tunnel dipped downward before rising again, creating a trough that was completely submerged. One of the community members returned from scouting ahead, water streaming from his clothes. "It's about 6 feet of complete submersion," he reported. with maybe 3 inches of airspace at the highest point. We'll need to move Harold through without letting the stretcher rise into the ceiling. The group fell silent, contemplating the dangerous task ahead. Harold's sedated state was now both blessing and curse. He wouldn't panic underwater, but also couldn't hold his breath or help himself in any way. "We can do this," Dylan said with more confidence than he felt. "4 of us can coordinate to keep him level and moving forward. I've done underwater photography. I can hold my breath for nearly 2 minutes." The former nurse approached with concern. "The sedative complicates things. His automatic reflexes may be suppressed. We'll need to ensure his airway stays completely clear." Using plastic sheeting from their supplies, they created a makeshift moisture barrier around Harold's face, leaving it loose enough for breathing but tight enough to provide some protection from splashing. With final preparations complete, the 4 men positioned themselves at each corner of the stretcher and began the delicate process of submerging into the flooded section. The shock of cold water stole Dylan's breath as he ducked under the surface. In the beam of his waterproof headlamp, he could see the other team members, their faces strained with concentration as they carefully maneuvered Harold's stretcher through the submerged passage. Every inch required perfect coordination, maintaining the precise depth that would keep Harold's face in the narrow air pocket near the ceiling. Halfway through, Dylan's lungs began burning for oxygen. The weight of the stretcher, the awkward positioning, and the cold all conspired to drain his strength faster than anticipated. Just as black spots began dancing at the edges of his vision, they reached the rising section of the tunnel, and Dylan gasped gratefully as his head broke the surface. They emerged from the underwater section with Harold still peacefully unconscious, his breathing unchanged. A small miracle that brought visible relief to all 4 bearers. But their respite was brief as they continued through the remaining narrow sections of the chimney. Upon finally reaching a more expansive chamber, Dylan was hit by another dissociative episode. One moment he was helping secure Harold's stretcher. The next, he found himself sitting against the cave wall, disoriented and confused, with several minutes missing from his memory. As his awareness returned, he noticed Martha watching him with understanding. "You're getting better at coming back," she observed, helping him to his feet. "The episodes are shorter now." Dylan rubbed his temples, forcing himself to focus on their surroundings. "I was afraid to tell anyone about them, afraid they'd think I was following Grandpa's path." Martha placed a weathered hand on his cheek. "You're learning to control them. That's good, Dylan. Knowing your limits is the first step to overcoming them." Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices from further up the passage. The final section of the chimney had been cleared, and daylight, albeit dim through the storm clouds, was visible at the end of the tunnel. Riley's face appeared at the opening, rain-soaked but grinning with relief. "Hurry it up!" he shouted over the storm. "Ground's getting more unstable by the minute." The remaining evacuation proceeded with renewed energy. Harold was carefully passed through the final narrow opening to waiting hands outside, followed by the last community members. Dylan insisted on being the final person to leave, ensuring everyone else made it to safety first. As he squeezed through the last section of the tunnel, an unexpected wave of emotion overwhelmed him. For 5 years, he'd been defined by searching for his missing grandparents. Now, having found them alive but dramatically changed, he faced an entirely new reality to process. Emerging into the rain-soaked daylight, Dylan found himself on a narrow ledge where the community members huddled under makeshift shelters. Martha sat beside Harold, who remained peacefully unaware, the sedative still holding him in gentle unconsciousness. The storm continued to rage around them, but its fury seemed diminished compared to the ordeal they'd just survived. Riley approached, clapping a hand on Dylan's shoulder. "Your tapping signals saved lives today. Smart thinking with that percussion code." Before Dylan could respond, Martha called out to him, her voice urgent. "Dylan, Harold's waking up." Moving quickly to his grandfather's side, Dylan watched as Harold's eyelids fluttered open. For a heart-stopping moment, recognition flickered in the elderly man's eyes, that precious clarity returning briefly as he focused on Dylan's face. "The mountains," Harold murmured, reaching out a trembling hand. "Did you photograph them like I taught you? Always catch the light between things." Then, like a candle flame in wind, the clarity vanished, replaced by the familiar vacant confusion. Harold's gaze drifted away, his momentary connection to the present slipping back into the fog of his condition. Martha wiped away a tear, squeezing Dylan's hand. "These moments are what I live for now," she whispered. "Brief windows when he returns to me." The group had little time to rest. While the immediate danger of cave flooding had passed, they now faced exposure to the elements on a precarious ledge. Riley explained that he'd managed to make radio contact with emergency services before the worst of the storm hit. "Rescue teams are on standby," he reported. "But with this weather, helicopter evacuation is impossible until the storm clears." With Riley's guidance, they began the difficult process of moving everyone to a more protected location, a wider ledge with a significant rock overhang, about a quarter-mile along the canyon wall. The journey was slow and treacherous, with Harold's stretcher requiring 6 carriers on the narrow path. "Your mother knows we've found something," Riley told Dylan as they walked. "I managed to get a brief message through before communications went down again." Dylan considered what this revelation would mean for Jennifer, the shock of learning her parents were alive after 5 years of mourning, the complicated emotions she would face upon discovering her mother's deliberate choice to disappear. As they settled into the more protected area, Lewis approached Dylan with uncharacteristic humility. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened," he said, his omnipresent camera nowhere to be seen. "This story isn't mine to tell. Whatever you and your family decide, I'll respect that." The sincerity in his voice surprised Dylan, who had written Lewis off as an opportunistic sensationalist. Perhaps the experience in the caves had transformed him as well. Night began to fall as the storm gradually weakened. The group huddled together for warmth and safety. Dylan sat beside Martha, who held Harold's hand even in sleep, their fingers intertwined by decades of habit. In this quiet moment, watching his grandmother's unwavering devotion, Dylan found a deeper understanding of love than he'd ever known. A thunderous roar suddenly erupted behind them, the tunnel they had escaped through collapsing completely as a new surge of floodwater burst from the opening. The violent torrent of muddy water cascaded down the canyon wall, obliterating the path they had taken less than an hour before, leaving only one direction possible: forward, toward the uncertain promise of rescue. The thunderous collapse of the tunnel sent a violent torrent of muddy water cascading down the canyon wall, obliterating the path they had taken less than an hour before. The group pressed themselves against the rock face as debris and water rushed past the ledge where they huddled. Dylan instinctively shielded Martha and Harold with his body, the roar of destruction drowning out their gasps of terror. "Everyone stay back from the edge," Riley shouted over the din, his experienced voice cutting through the chaos. As the initial surge subsided, leaving only a steady stream flowing from the former exit, the gravity of their situation became clear. They were trapped on a narrow ledge with no way back and an uncertain path forward. The storm continued to rage above them, though its intensity had diminished slightly, allowing brief glimpses of the darkening sky through breaks in the clouds. "We need to move," Samuel declared, surveying their precarious position. "This ledge could be the next to go if the ground keeps saturating." Riley nodded in agreement, pointing toward a faint trail that continued along the canyon wall. "There's a wider shelf about a quarter-mile ahead. It'll give us more protection and a better position for rescue teams to spot us when the weather clears." The group mobilized with remarkable efficiency, their earlier ordeal in the caves having forged an unlikely bond between the isolated community members and their unexpected visitors. 4 men carefully lifted Harold's stretcher the former geologist still drifting in and out of sedated consciousness, occasionally mumbling fragments of scientific observations about the rock formations surrounding them. Martha refused to leave his side, her weathered hand maintaining constant contact with her husband as they navigated the treacherous path. Dylan stayed close behind them, his photographer's eye automatically noting how the fading daylight cast long shadows across the ancient stone, creating a dramatic tableau of human perseverance against the elements. The narrow trail demanded their complete attention, forcing them to move in single file along sections where the ledge narrowed to barely the width of a footstep. Water continued to seep from the saturated ground above, making the stones slick and treacherous. Every few minutes, Riley would call for a halt as he assessed the stability of the path ahead. "Watch your footing here," he warned as they approached a particularly narrow section. "Step exactly where I step." The carriers maneuvered Harold's stretcher with painstaking care, lifting it nearly vertically to navigate the constricted passage. Dylan held his breath as they inched forward, acutely aware that a single misstep could send his grandfather plummeting into the canyon below. The moment stretched into an eternity of tension, until finally, the stretcher passed through safely, eliciting a collective sigh of relief from the group. As they continued their careful progress, Dylan detected a faint rhythmic sound cutting through the ambient noise of wind and water. He strained to identify it until realization struck, the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors, still distant, but approaching. "Riley," he called out. "Do you hear that?" The former ranger tilted his head, listening intently before breaking into a rare smile. "Search and rescue. They must have gotten a break in the weather." Hope surged through the exhausted group as the sound grew louder. Within minutes, a rescue helicopter appeared around the canyon bend, its powerful searchlight cutting through the remaining mist and drizzle. The aircraft hovered at a safe distance from the cliff face, the downwash creating swirling eddies in the waterfall still flowing from the collapsed cave entrance. Riley immediately produced a small emergency signal mirror from his pack, using it to catch and reflect the helicopter's searchlight in a deliberate pattern. The helicopter responded by adjusting its position, the pilot acknowledging their location. "They can't land here," Riley explained. "The ledge is too narrow and unstable. They'll need to hoist us up one by one." Within 20 minutes, the rescue operation was underway. A flight medic was lowered to their position first, bringing with him emergency supplies and a communication system. After a quick assessment of the group, he prioritized the evacuation order. Harold would go first, followed by the most vulnerable community members. "We'll need to secure him in a special basket stretcher," the medic explained as he examined Harold's condition. "The sedative seems to be wearing off, which is good for the aerial evacuation. We don't want him panicking midair." Martha watched anxiously as they transferred her husband to the rescue basket, her face etched with conflicting emotions. "I should go with him," she insisted. "He might become confused without me there." The medic nodded, understanding, but stood firm. "The basket can only safely carry one. You'll be on the next lift, I promise. We have medical staff standing by who are experienced with dementia patients." The delicate operation of hoisting Harold into the helicopter proceeded with professional precision. Dylan and Martha watched, hands clasped tightly together, as the basket containing Harold was slowly winched upward, swaying slightly in the gusty air. Only when he was safely aboard did Martha release the breath she'd been holding. True to the medic's word, Martha was next, followed by the elderly community members. Each successful extraction lightened the mood on the ledge slightly, though anxiety remained high as the daylight continued to fade and the helicopter had to rely increasingly on its powerful spotlights to maintain visual contact with the cliff face. "Your turn," Riley told Dylan as the basket descended once more. Dylan shook his head. "I'll go after Lewis and the others. I want to make sure everyone gets out safely." Riley studied him for a moment before nodding with newfound respect. "Your grandparents raised you right, kid." One by one, the remaining community members were lifted to safety until only Dylan, Riley, Lewis, and Samuel remained on the ledge. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the communication device, warning that fuel concerns would necessitate a return to base after 2 more extractions. They would need to send a second helicopter for the final pair. "You two go," Samuel said to Dylan and Lewis. "You have family waiting. Riley and I can hold out until the second helicopter arrives." Lewis, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet throughout the ordeal, stepped forward. "I'll stay with Riley. Dylan should go. His grandparents will need him." The selfless offer from the man Dylan had earlier despised for his opportunism came as a genuine surprise. Lewis seemed to read his expression and shrugged slightly. "Some stories matter more than others," he said simply. "This one's about family, not ratings." With reluctance, Dylan allowed himself to be secured into the rescue harness. As he was lifted away from the ledge, he watched Riley and Lewis grow smaller below him, 2 unlikely allies awaiting their own rescue against the massive backdrop of the canyon. The sensation of swinging freely in the air reminded him of his early days as an adventure photographer, though the stakes had never been so personal. Inside the helicopter, medical personnel efficiently checked him for injuries, while the pilot communicated their imminent departure for the nearest hospital. Through the window, Dylan could see Martha sitting beside Harold's stretcher, her hand still firmly grasping his. The flight to the regional medical center took just under 30 minutes, during which Dylan learned that his mother had been contacted and was already on her way. The realization that he would soon need to explain everything, the search, the community, the deliberate disappearance, settled over him like a physical weight. As they landed on the hospital helipad, organized chaos ensued. Harold was immediately transferred to a waiting medical team, with Martha insisting on remaining at his side despite the staff's attempts to separate them for individual assessments. Dylan followed closely, determined not to lose sight of his grandparents again after 5 years of searching. Inside the emergency department, curtained examination areas were quickly filled with community members, many of whom were experiencing their first interaction with modern medical facilities in years. Social workers and police officers began appearing, their faces showing the complicated mixture of confusion and amazement that came with processing a group of people who had been legally declared dead or missing. A young doctor approached Dylan as he stood outside the room where Harold was being examined. "Your grandfather is stable," she assured him. "The sedative is wearing off naturally, and there's no indication of hypothermia or other acute issues. Physically, he's in remarkably good condition for his age and circumstances." "And his Alzheimer's?" Dylan asked. The doctor's expression softened. "We've done some preliminary cognitive assessments. The disease is advanced, but there are interesting patterns to his lucidity. The simplified environment he's been living in may actually have benefited him in some ways. We'd like to do more comprehensive testing once he's rested." A commotion at the emergency department entrance drew Dylan's attention. Jennifer Wilson burst through the automatic doors, her wild eyes scanning the chaos until they locked onto her son. For a moment, she stood frozen, as if unable to process what she was seeing. Then she ran, forward, engulfing Dylan in a fierce embrace. "They told me on the phone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They said you found them, that they're alive. I didn't believe it, I couldn't, until now." Dylan held his mother tightly, feeling her body shake with silent sobs. Over her shoulder, he watched as Martha emerged from Harold's room, stopping short at the sight of her daughter. The 2 women stared at each other across the busy hospital corridor, 5 years of absence suspended between them. As the helicopters of rescue pounded and the media began to arrive, Martha firmly held Dylan's hand and said, "We need to talk with your mother. There's an important choice we all need to make now." 2 weeks after the dramatic rescue from the canyon, a gentle spring breeze carried the scent of pine through the open windows of the hospital waiting room. Dylan sat beside Martha, both of them tense with anticipation as they awaited Jennifer's arrival. The past 14 days had been a whirlwind of medical examinations, police interviews, and media attempts to piece together the extraordinary story of the Canyon community, as they'd been dubbed by the press. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Dylan asked Martha, noticing how she nervously adjusted the unfamiliar modern clothing she'd been given, a simple blue blouse and slacks that seemed at odds with the weathered, practical woman he'd discovered in the cave. Martha nodded, though her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "It's time. Jennifer deserves the full truth, not just the fragments she's gotten from officials and reporters." The sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor made them both look up. Jennifer Wilson appeared in the doorway, stopping abruptly at the sight of her mother. For a moment, mother and daughter simply stared at each other, Jennifer in her polished business attire, Martha in her hospital-issued clothing, the 5-year gap between them manifesting physically in the white hair and deeper lines that now marked Martha's face. "Mom," Jennifer whispered, the single word carrying a universe of complex emotions. Martha stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her arms. Jennifer rushed forward, the initial hesitation crumbling as she fell into her mother's embrace. The first words that escaped her came in a broken whisper. "How could you?" The question hung incomplete, interrupted by tears that both women had clearly been holding back. Dylan remained seated, allowing them this moment of reconnection, acutely aware that his mother's question contained multitudes. How could you disappear? How could you let us mourn? How could you choose that life over us? After the emotional reunion, a nurse guided them to Harold's room. Jennifer paused at the threshold, visibly bracing herself before entering. Harold sat in a chair by the window, his white hair neatly combed, his expression placid as he watched birds on the feeder outside. The hospital room had been modified with familiar objects from the cave community: a hand-woven blanket, simple wooden carvings, photographs carefully preserved through the years. "Dad?" Jennifer called softly, approaching with caution. Harold turned with a polite smile that showed no recognition. "Hello," he said pleasantly, as if greeting a kind stranger. "Are you here to see the birds? The little ones with red chests come every morning." Jennifer's face crumpled momentarily before she composed herself. "Yes," she managed. "I'd love to see the birds with you." Martha stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Harold's shoulder. "This is our daughter, Jennifer," she explained, her voice carrying the practiced patience of years spent navigating these waters. "Our daughter," Harold repeated, nodding as if accepting a piece of trivial information. "You have a kind face, like Martha's." The interaction set the tone for what would be a challenging adjustment period. Later that afternoon, Dylan accompanied his mother and grandmother to a meeting with hospital administrators, legal representatives, and 2 police detectives who had been assigned to close the long-open missing persons case. The conference room felt sterile and intimidating after the natural environment of the Canyon community. Martha sat straight-backed in her chair as the officials discussed the legal implications of their voluntary disappearance and the status of the other community members, many of whom had their own complicated legal situations to resolve. "Mrs. Wilson," one detective said, consulting his notes, "you understand that resources were expended searching for you and your husband? That legally abandoning your property and disappearing without notification could be considered—" "My mother made the only choice she could, under impossible circumstances," Jennifer interrupted, surprising Dylan with her fierce defense. Earlier that morning, she had listened to Martha's full explanation in private, a conversation that had clearly transformed her understanding of the situation. Dylan leaned forward, adding his own perspective. "They shouldn't be punished for an act of love. My grandmother chose my grandfather's dignity and peace over everything else. Nobody was intentionally harmed." The meeting concluded with a tentative agreement. No charges would be filed, but there would be a significant amount of paperwork to resurrect the Wilsons legally, address tax issues, and navigate the complexities of Harold's medical care going forward. That evening, Dylan and Jennifer visited the community center, where most of Samuel's people were temporarily housed, while authorities worked to establish their identities and situations. The large community room hummed with subdued conversation as people who had lived off the grid for years attempted to reconcile with the modern world they'd left behind. "Some of them don't want to stay," Dylan observed, watching as one of the older community members stubbornly refused a social worker's offer of housing assistance. "They chose that life for a reason." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that, about what Mom said regarding Dad's condition and how the simplified environment actually helped him in some ways." The following day, Dylan arranged a meeting with Lewis, who had been unexpectedly supportive throughout the aftermath. The former podcaster had declined all media requests for interviews and had destroyed his own recordings of the discovery, citing the family's privacy. "I've been thinking," Dylan said as they walked through the hospital garden where Harold was enjoying the sunshine with Martha, "about what happens next for them." Lewis nodded. "The doctor said your grandfather does better with routine and familiar surroundings. Bringing him back to a standard nursing facility might not be the best option." Dylan shared the idea he'd been developing, a cabin on the property of his former photography mentor, a remote but accessible location that would provide the peace Harold needed while ensuring he had proper medical care. Lewis immediately offered his help in setting up the space, his expertise in minimalist living suddenly valuable in a new context. When Dylan presented the idea to Jennifer that afternoon, she initially resisted. "They need proper medical care, not more isolation," she argued, the practical caretaker in her emerging strongly. The family's discussion with Harold's specialist proved illuminating. "For patients with Alzheimer's," the doctor explained, "familiar environments and stable routines are fundamental. Dramatic changes can accelerate decline. Your father has established patterns in a simplified setting that appear to be serving him well. His physical health is remarkably good for his age and condition." To help Jennifer understand, the doctor showed them comparative cognitive assessments. "Notice these patterns of lucidity? They often correlate with natural surroundings, reduced stimulation, and the presence of your mother. A compromise might be best. A simplified living situation, but with proper medical support nearby." A week later, the family visited the potential cabin, a simple but comfortable structure on a wooded hillside with a view of distant mountains. The property belonged to James Whitaker, Dylan's first photography mentor, who had gladly offered it upon hearing the extraordinary story. "It's isolated enough for privacy, but only 20 minutes from medical facilities," Dylan explained as they explored the rustic space. "And there's a guest cottage where visiting nurses could stay during care rotations." As they stood on the porch overlooking the landscape, Harold, who had been mostly silent during the visit, suddenly spoke with unexpected clarity. "This reminds me of that place in Colorado," he said to Martha. "Remember? Where we camped that summer before Dylan was born." The spontaneous memory, so specific and accurate, brought tears to Martha's eyes. She squeezed his hand gently, savoring the momentary connection. "Yes, dear. By the lake with the little blue flowers all along the shore." That moment proved decisive for Jennifer, who finally recognized the wisdom in Martha's original choice. Though not perfect, the cabin represented a compromise that honored both Harold's needs and the family's desire to remain connected. 2 days later, as they began moving essential items into the cabin, Dylan discovered an old Nikon camera in one of Harold's boxes that had been recovered from the community. The camera still contained a roll of partially exposed film. Curious, Dylan carefully rewound it and arranged to have it developed at a specialty shop that still processed analog film. When the photographs were ready, They revealed a visual narrative of Harold and Martha's final journey, the beginning images showing them happy and engaged, followed by increasingly disoriented compositions as Harold's condition apparently worsened. The final shots captured the canyon community that had taken them in, documenting a way of life that had remained hidden from the outside world for decades. These images became the spark for Dylan's new project, a sensitive photographic study of memory, loss, and caregiving that would eventually form his first gallery exhibition in years. On a sunny morning, 3 weeks after the rescue, Jennifer officially signed the paperwork accepting the cabin arrangement with provisions for regular medical visits and monitoring. "I'm still not entirely comfortable with this," she admitted to Dylan as they watched Martha helping Harold settle into their new home. "But I understand now why she made the choices she did. Sometimes love looks different than we expect." While helping to install a wheelchair ramp at the cabin's entrance, Dylan found Harold's old camera, and upon turning it on, discovered dozens of undeveloped photos from their last trip, images that might tell the complete story of the final days before their disappearance. Dylan's hands trembled slightly as he carefully placed the final photograph on the drying rack in the makeshift darkroom he'd set up in the cabin's tool shed. The last image from Harold's camera emerged from the chemical bath. A slightly out-of-focus shot of Martha standing beside the motorhome, her expression a complex mixture of concern and resolution. The sequence of photographs told a visual story more powerful than any verbal explanation could convey. The gradual transformation of a planned adventure into something else entirely. The 36 exposures revealed the chronology of his grandparents' final journey in haunting detail. The first dozen showed the typical vacation documentation: Harold proudly standing beside geological formations, Martha smiling at roadside diners, both of them posing at scenic overlooks. Then, almost imperceptibly, the images began to change. Harold's compositions became increasingly erratic. Horizon lines tilted dramatically, subjects partially cut off, the same rock formation photographed multiple times from slightly different angles, as if he couldn't remember having already captured it. The final sequence revealed something Dylan had never expected. Photographs taken by someone else, likely Martha, showing Harold looking confused beside the damaged motorhome, followed by images of their first encounters with members of the hidden community. These previously undeveloped frames filled critical gaps in the story, providing visual evidence of the accident that had stranded them and the compassion that had ultimately sheltered them. Moving carefully through his improvised darkroom, Dylan began arranging the photographs in chronological order. He'd spent the past 3 weeks meticulously developing each roll recovered from Harold's camera, treating the negatives with the reverence of historical artifacts. In many ways, that's exactly what they were: a documented history of choices made in the face of impossible circumstances. The wooden door creaked open slightly, allowing a thin beam of sunlight to slice through the darkened space. "Dylan?" Martha's voice called softly. "Are you still working in there?" "Just finishing," he answered, quickly covering the chemical trays. "You can come in now. Everything's fixed." Martha entered cautiously, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dim red light. Though she'd adapted remarkably well to returning to the modern world, some aspects still seemed to disorient her. Electricity available at the flip of a switch, running water without collection efforts, the constant connectivity of phones and computers that Dylan and Jennifer took for granted. "Harold is having a good morning," she said, approaching the drying photographs with obvious emotional trepidation. He remembered Jennifer's name when she called, even asked about her husband by name. She didn't mention that Jennifer had been divorced for 3 years. These fragments of Harold's past often surfaced without context or chronology. Dylan gently guided his grandmother to the chronologically arranged images. "I thought you might want to see these before anyone else. They tell your story better than words ever could." Martha's weathered fingers hovered over the photographs without touching them, her eyes filling with tears. as she recognized moments she'd likely tried to forget. "He was so excited when we started that trip," she whispered. He'd been planning it for months, researching that community, convinced they had some special geological knowledge. She paused at an image of Harold pointing excitedly at a map spread across the motorhome's small table. "This was the last day he knew me completely. The next morning, he called me by his sister's name." Together, they studied the visual documentation of that pivotal journey, Martha occasionally filling in context that the images alone couldn't provide. For Dylan, these photographs were more than family artifacts. They were the foundation for something larger. "I've been thinking," he said as they reached the final images, "about turning these into an exhibition, not as some sensational story about the missing grandparents, but as a documentation of love, memory, and the choices we make for those we care about." Martha studied her grandson's face, her expression thoughtful. "Your grandfather always said you saw things differently through your lens, found beauty and meaning, where others saw only surfaces." Later that afternoon, Dylan drove to the small town 30 minutes from the cabin, his portfolio case containing selected prints from Harold's camera, alongside his own recent photographs. The local gallery was modest, a converted Victorian house with creaking wooden floors and tall windows that flooded the space with natural light. The owner, Eleanor Santos, had shown Dylan's landscape work years earlier, before his career had stalled amidst his obsessive search. "Dylan Wilson," she said warmly as he entered, though her eyes reflected surprise at his unexpected appearance. "It's been, 4 years since I've seen you? And suddenly you're all over the news with this incredible story." "That's actually why I'm here," Dylan replied, carefully placing his portfolio on her desk. "I want to tell the real story, Eleanor, not the sensationalized version the media has latched onto." Eleanor listened attentively as Dylan explained his concept for Echoes of Silence, a photographic narrative exploring memory, caregiving, and the different forms love takes when confronted with loss. As he spoke, he laid out prints from both Harold's camera and his own recent work documenting Harold and Martha's new life at the cabin, alongside portraits of other elderly couples facing similar challenges. "This isn't just about my grandparents anymore," Dylan explained. "During these weeks, I've met so many families navigating memory loss, making impossible choices with no clear answers. Their stories deserve to be seen with dignity." Eleanor examined the photographs with a curator's practiced eye. "There's something remarkably intimate about these," she observed, pausing over an image Dylan had captured of Martha guiding Harold's hands to shape clay, an activity the doctor had suggested might stimulate tactile memory. "They're not voyeuristic or sentimental. They're honest." 2 days later, Jennifer visited the cabin, bringing supplies and the latest update from Harold's specialist. Dylan watched the still-evolving reunion between mother and daughter, the cautious rebuilding of trust evident in their careful conversations. The initial shock and hurt had gradually transformed into something more complex. Not quite forgiveness yet, but understanding. "The doctor says Dad's overall health is stabilizing," Jennifer reported as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching Harold and Martha in the small garden they'd begun establishing. "The routine here seems to be helping. His blood pressure's lower than it's been in years." Dylan nodded, observing how Martha gently guided Harold's hands to feel the different textures of plants, his grandfather responding with childlike wonder to each new sensation. "They've established a rhythm here. It's different from what they had in the cave community, but it preserves what mattered most about that life. Simplicity, nature, no pressure to remember or conform." Jennifer sighed, the weight of mixed emotions evident in her expression. "I still struggle with it sometimes, that Mom chose to let us believe they were dead, rather than telling us the truth about Dad's condition. But watching them together now," she gestured toward the garden where Harold had briefly taken Martha's hand, a moment of connection that might have been muscle memory or might have been recognition. I'm beginning to understand it wasn't about abandoning us. It was about protecting him. A week later, the small gallery hosted the opening of Echoes of Silence. Dylan had worried that few would attend a photography exhibition focused on such a challenging subject, but the room filled quickly, some drawn by curiosity about the Canyon couple story that had made national headlines, others by genuine interest in the artistic exploration of memory and caregiving. The exhibition's centerpiece featured Harold's photographs alongside Dylan's, creating a visual conversation across time. Additional walls displayed Dylan's new portrait series of other caregivers and their loved ones, each image accompanied by brief, powerful statements about their experiences navigating memory loss. Martha attended briefly, supported by Jennifer and a part-time nurse who had been helping at the cabin. Harold remained at home, the stimulation of the gallery opening deemed too overwhelming by his doctors. As Martha moved through the space, seeing their private journey displayed with such care and dignity, tears flowed freely down her weathered cheeks. "You've transformed our story into something that can help others," she told Dylan, gripping his hand tightly. "That's more than I ever expected when we made our choices 5 years ago." The exhibition received unexpected attention, with a local TV station running a thoughtful segment on its approach to a difficult subject. Within days, Dylan began receiving messages from families in similar situations, thanking him for the honest portrayal of their often invisible struggles. Riley, who had taken a surprising interest in the project, offered his assistance for Dylan's next phase, documenting other alternative communities where people had chosen different ways of caring for vulnerable family members. "I know other areas where people have created their own solutions," he explained. "Not all hidden in caves, but definitely outside the mainstream." On a crisp morning 1 month after the rescue, Dylan pulled into the familiar gas station where his journey had begun. Maya looked up from the register, her surprise quickly transforming into a warm smile of recognition. "Well, look who's back," she said as he approached the counter. "You're quite the celebrity now. Found what you were looking for, I take it?" Dylan smiled, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a photograph. Martha and Harold sitting together on the cabin's porch, their weathered hands intertwined as they watched the sunset. He placed it on the counter between them. "I discovered that sometimes, when we think people have disappeared," Dylan said, meeting Maya's curious gaze with newfound peace in his own, "they've just found a different place to exist."